Yeah, no, it's recording.
Thank you.
Okay, you're here.
Oh, we should all probably try not to knock then.
Okay.
Everyone good to go? Cool. So this is a brief model that this applies to U.S. and U.S.-esque presidential systems where the branches of power are distinct from the legislative and the executive, unless you want to impeach the Queen in Great Britain. I think that'd be fucking epic. Beyond that, though, I think that's what our model is going to be. Legislators can issue the application for impeachment, and the trial and the decision is decided by the judiciary. Any questions?
Legislators are the only ones that issue the application.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Is everybody good to go?
Wait.
Oh.
No,
Okay, good.
Awesome. We have just two independent points. One, legislators thumbs down. Other one, judiciary thumbs up. So first, legislator thumbs down. Lobbying and legislators all holistically are very, very bad. We have 4 reasons why this is the case. The first is just lobbying distorts decision-making processes. It is far easier for private vested interests to donate to the campaigns of legislators who have constant incentives to get more money to get reelected. Secondarily, because there's so many more legislators and members of the judiciary, it's easier to find seedier backdoor relationships between party infrastructures and individuals on that level, as well as local vested interest groups for the legislative bodies and the individual representatives themselves. Moreover, we think it is far, far easier to give special privileges and powers to individual congresspeople from, or any sort of parliamentarian or something like that, from broader structures of lobbying by giving them special privileges that exist that are much harder for people to see because no one knows who other representatives are besides their own. I mean, there's very little accountability towards individual legislators on this front. Moreover, they lack information to make decisions a lot of the time, individual legislatures, so they often need to get information from other vested interest groups who utilize that to get interest and information as well as influence down the road. We think this is very clear that vested interests that are against impeachment have a lot of clout with congressional bodies and will have powerful influence upon whether or not those impeachments will actually be decided one way or another. They can utilize this to lobby hard against certain vested groups, and ultimately means it's very, very hard for legislators to get a meaningfully non-distorted decision upon whether someone is guilty. Second, on the gerrymandering and fraudulent districting. This is just descriptively true, but there's also incentives for every single political party to work with other political parties to divvy up political territory for special safe seats for themselves and others, because the elites have that common interest, and then they can let their lower tier members battle it out in some small districts. The vast majority of them are going to be profoundly illogical. Couple of problems with this. First, it means that they're not really representative, that the legislator is not really representing the people, but rather representatives of very disparate different groups of ideologically divided populations that are also cherry-picked to support their vested interests and are also drawn around racialized and class-based lines, oftentimes designed to keep people disenfranchised from power, making it harder for them to access the legislature for their own benefits. This leads to racialized and class-based delineations upon congressional bodies that we think is always going to be leading to more benefits towards the elites, because even if people from poor districts are getting represented, they need more money and therefore are going to be linked into the lobbying thing we talked about earlier. This means that they're not making a choice entirely about anything on their own. They're not even making their own decisions. They're entirely ad hoc to a very ideological base that is all the same. This means that a congressperson just does a poll on their own district to see what do you think about impeachment and then votes along those lines. There's no deliberation upon them. There's no discussion upon them that's meaningful. There's no actual thinking on them behind what will get me elected next time. There's no actual incentives for them to do anything different. Third, on polarization. Ideology in parliaments and Congress is always a rewarding thing. It's posturing, it lets you get more media press. It also means that you get seen as someone that's actually relevant. If you're saying something that's hot takes that get people put in the press, that people can see, make people motivated. The primaries for getting people elected to be representatives and candidates are done through the parties, which are not a democratic process, but actually membership-based political organizations, and also encourages more radicalization as primary voters are more likely to be more radical and more likely to have strong ideological beliefs in testing and purity testing that will apply to their candidates because they see the party as an ideological machine to get what they want. All of this means that they're extraordinarily more ideologically delineated and therefore not likely to be making choices based on what they think is guilt or innocence, but rather based on what is expedient for their own political movements, which polarizes not just the Congress in and of itself, but also will polarize and politicize the impeachment process when it's carried out, and you just see that the D's and the R's are voting one way or the other, entirely based on what they actually think. Fourth is the balance of power question. We think very clearly the legislator now has complete total power to strip power from the executive when they can both issue and then also try the executive branch. This means the executive branch is entirely ad hoc to Congress, and Congress can do whatever it wants to, destroy the executive or hold the executive to get to do whatever it wants. Moreover, though, this is also bidirectional loss of balance of power. That is to say, the courts now have less capacity to check the actions of the presidency because they can no longer impeach the presidency on their own front. In this system that we have and we're proposing, it allows for a dual check from both the Congress to issue the impeachment and then for the Supreme Court or whatever court is deciding this to decide that adjudication of guilt. This has 2 tiers of checks, which are far better in a system where we value checks and balances, but also ultimately good for balances between different branches that could get politicized one way or another against each other. It's harder to politicize all of them at the same time. We think ultimately, though, a world in which Congress or a legislative body is the only actor on impeachment, you get very, very bad politicization of the process. What does this look like? This means that they're not just saying you violated as an individual actor this thing and therefore you ought to be impeached. Rather, you as a representative of this ideological movement and party are violating the constitutional principles. You're all complicit, therefore you're all responsible. This means that you get infinite more impeachments issued from the Congress or legislative bodies because they just characterize this as something endemic to the entirety of the executive, the entirety of the party that is occupying the executive at the present moment, and will then continue to make those sort of pushes. That is really, really bad. Looking at history, this didn't happen with Nixon only because Agnew was removed before that, and ultimately we think that sort of thing would happen far more perniciously if someone like that was in power. We're ultimately re-politicize this, and we can see in the future how we politicize the impeachment process and how those things have gotten worse over time historically. Our second independent point, courts thumbs up. For one, the politicization comparative. Very clearly, they are much less likely to be ad hoc to political interests because they have lifetime appointments or appointments for a very long period of time, which shields a backlash, and they don't also need electoral infrastructure to the same degree. Second, they have less proximity to wealthy vested interests. They have less capacity to lobby. Third, the trust and the spectacle. People really fucking trust the courts, especially people that aren't particularly political or interested in politics. People that see the judiciary see it steeped in procedures, steeped and based on documents, and even when they see levels of politicization, they see it through politicization through the lens of a document that is valid and dictated by a certain Overton window that's much more structurally sound rather than ones based on radical political beliefs and ideologies by random members of the Congress. This means that they're much less likely to distrust the decision made by the judiciary, much less likely to carry it on and push for it in more avenues, or fight back when they think the decision is incorrect, because they trust that imagery of the court, something they associate with balance, something they associate with fairness, something they associate with procedures that are actually well thought out. Fourth, under this, we think justices self-select themselves based on ethics. Basically, being a judge requires a lot of work for not as much payoff as being like a congressman is, right? Like, these people actually care about the law and have heard enough from other people explaining why things like legal consistency and following precedent is so important that they actually ideologically believe this to be true. Moreover, though, if they want to just make profit and were self-interested, they would have joined the other branches instead. And also, very clearly, even if they are self-interested, their ideological, their beliefs about what makes them more powerful or have prestige is from being consistent. So the prestige of the position comes from being apartial and apolitical. So no one wants to desecrate their office or be seen as the first justice to be political in that instance, which we think is far, far worse on their side of the house in terms of having the legislature being like that. The ideological legislature also can check itself when they're appointing justices. So unlike the body itself, which is deeply politicized, they have to make compromises for who they can pass to put onto the justices, so they're more going to be political moderates and the people are actually appointing them. So there's some degree of forced compromise between two largely equivalent political bodies in the Congress to get the majority or two-thirds majority, whatever necessary, to get them appointed. Finally, then, on consistency and precedent. We think very clearly they're built on consistency with the law, there are fair standards, and discourages absurd attempts, and encourages the procedures being done fairly, as they are being binded by political statutes that they are much more familiar with. Things are not going to be influenced by law being to characterize them one way or another based on their actual fundamental beliefs that are consistent. We think on the weighing this is very clear. The government's job is to prevent violence in the state of nature. We think politicization of political appointees in the impeachment process opens the chance for more distrust in institutions and less buy-in to those institutions, and makes people more likely to turn to political violence with ideological gains that they want, and that is something that is profoundly bad in our society. Proud to notice.
Here, here. I thank PM for their remarks and call upon the LO. Woo!
Three arguments. First, impeachment is not analogous to what courts do, and courts are not equipped to do it. Not only is this decision politicized, but it isn't finding a fact in the way that courts do. You aren't working with a clear case law, and the moral categories themselves are in flux. High crimes and misdemeanors mean something depending on your interpretation of what the national interest is, what a moral determination about a high crime versus any other crime is, and courts probably aren't suited to do that. Courts work when they have a clear mandate to interpret law in a particular and consistent way, not to make these sorts of moral determinations about the national interest. For that, you need democratically elected legislatures, which may be imperfect, but are better than courts. Second, courts are not qualified to do this because they are self-interested. That is to say, they're appointed by the executive branch. This would be a conflict of interest that would prevent the court from ruling on such a matter in almost any case. We think there's a clearer delineation between the political branches of government and the executive branches of government. The argument here is simple. Only legislatures can yield an accurate determination. Maybe there are distortions to that determination, but it is principally not something that a court can do to determine impeachment. As a consequence, there is a certainty of an illegitimate outcome versus however you adjudicate the clash about legislatures. Second argument, on separation of powers. First, tying courts up with this delegitimizes courts. And we think courts do useful things. They say that courts will have no check over the president. But that's not true. They can still render things that the president does unconstitutional and stop that from happening. The only way that they do that, though, is if people buy into the courts. And look, people deeply care about these decisions about impeachment, but they also are unlikely to have opinions on the nuances. I was dreading a motion on impeachment because I don't understand all of the nuances of the emoluments clause or whatever. So the idea then is that people deeply care but don't have that many proxies for making this decision, so they'll default to what they believe. That politicizes the courts more and delegitimizes their ability to do their job. But second, we just think this is an important check for the legislature to have. Look, it just isn't the case always that legislatures just the executives just go along with the legislature. When the House of Commons said that Boris Johnson had to ask for an extension, he didn't do that. When the Parliament of Czechia said that Andrzej Duda had to replace the justice minister, he didn't do that. So it is only a real check if you can remove the president. That doesn't mean you get to pick a new president. It's presumably the vice president, or worst case, there's a new election. So it's not an unmitigated check, but it's only a real check by the political democratic branch of the government if they are able to do that. Finally, we would say, under this, that legislatures are better able to calibrate when to initiate these proceedings. That is to say, I think that it is probably likely that if it's a strictly legal determination, which is giving them their best case about how courts adjudicate this, then people will bring a decision to a court whenever they think the legal case is in their merit. But if the legal case is in their merit, but the popular sentiment isn't, it's not actually an effective check, right? Because what happens is you get the court to rule against the president in question, but then, Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, they come back as the vice president, they come back through some back door, they ignore the court, as in the case of Evo Morales or Pierre Nkurunziza. So the idea then that legislatures initiate it when they think that there is a political chance that this will be successful means that they can calibrate their chance of initiating impeachment to a time when impeachment will actually succeed. So we think that you should consider these arguments about checks and separation of powers to be functional rather than formal. That is to say, the point of separation of powers isn't just to look nice in a civics textbook, is to actually check the powers. And that only happens when you have a body that is able to calibrate them doing this to a time in which it will actually succeed. Courts definitionally can't do that. The final argument I want to make off case is about narratives and national healing. Look, probably the most important class of times in this debate is when the president has done something truly bad that fractures the national conception of how their politics works and that most people find anathema. In this, the process of impeachment when the legislature does it is different. Why? Because these Congress people are using rhetoric that appeals to people. They are making people understand in a more public way what this person has done and why it was wrong, rather than relying on an obscure and arcane legal judgment. That means that you get a better narrative, you get a better discussion that actually shifts the norms and creates new national norms against statutory malfeasance in the long term. So in terms of there being the type of norms that hold democracy together, because at the end of the day, that is required to hold a democracy together. You have a better conversation when it happens in public, not behind a row and paragraphs of obscure text. Case side. First, we get a list of arguments about why legislatures are imperfect. So in the first case, I think if you accept that legislatures should still make laws, then clearly these are not arguments that legislatures shouldn't fulfill their function. So if you believe our argument that this is part of the function of a legislature, then these arguments don't matter. Second, these are broadly arguments for regulation. But let's go through them. I might have to be a little bit fast here. So they said lobbying. Unlikely that lobbying plays such a role on such a high-profile issue. Your constituents are engaged with this, they care, they have partisan loyalties. I don't know what special interests you're doing. They say you rely on lobbyists for information. Presumably in liberal democracies, there's some competition between vested interests that are pro and cons. You get some information, you choose between the information. That seems fine. These are just generic arguments that don't really apply to the case. They say that you're ideological. So think about the judges that we have that are picked by the executive. I think they're probably ideological too. They say they're just going to rely on the polls and not deliberate. I think this is wrong. I think that people who are tasked with trying impeachment in the legislatures do deliberate deeply. Why? Because these are cases that break with an established political precedent and create new beliefs. So not only is it the case that they actually don't know what their constituents want, because polling on these issues is difficult and so on, but it's also the case case that they need to predict how popular this will be in the future, how this will accord with future political narratives. That's really hard to do, and that's the type of thing they will deliberate on, even if they are just self-interested and don't care about actually making the right decision, which they probably also do. They say that primaries lead to radicalization. 1, a US-centric account of how primaries work, not universally true. 2, not really. Incumbents win most of the time. I don't think this is empirical. They have to appeal to moderates to win the general election, so even if they say radical stuff during the primary, they shift back. Next, they say that Congress will just do this whatever. So, and the problem is it's a check. It's too much of a check because Congress can just do whatever. So, 1, presumably they can only credibly do this when there actually is something really bad, so it's an appropriate check. 2, they can't pick a new president. They say courts can't check the president in their role. Yes, they can still stop actions of the president. They say there were lots of impeachments. I think impeachment would still be relatively rare. I think moderates would see this as a disruption to the kind of getting along collegial functioning of the political system that moderates, in their naivete, tend to be concerned about. I think that that's a reason that it won't happen too much. Next, some arguments about why courts are good. First, people trust the courts. I think they are alienated by the rogues and the jargon. And also, first of all, Antonin Scalia is a very serious legal scholar, but how many fucking liberals think that? Nobody trusts him. Second, they say that courts are apolitical. Again, US-centric in that they're lifetime appointments. They may have future ambitions. Just, again, empirically, I don't think they're apolitical. Third, they self-select on ethics because you become a congressperson to get rich. So, 1, some freshman congress people literally sleep in their office. Number 2, I think congress people also care about ethics in the fact that they want to go into public policy to some extent. Unclear this is a real comparative. They say you can't make compromises. Presumably, or you can't make compromises. Presumably it's easier to make compromises in a legislature, especially at a time when political loyalties are in flux, than it is when you have to pick a single person to fill that seat on the court, and that's more of a zero-sum thing, and then you get more radical people on the court. So I just think they gave you a bunch of generic arguments that didn't really speak to probably why this motion was set, for that purpose.
I thank the LO for their remarks and call upon the MG. Woo!
First, before I start, shout out to the people from my team who are still here, even though you have to be. Shout out to everybody in the audience sticking around. Harvard, thank you for some great tournaments. Y'all are really cool. Always enjoy my rounds against you. Actually, I don't know if I've made it, but only a few times. On that note, is everybody good to go? I want to start with a brief overview on a characterization of who's actually getting impeached and what ends up happening in these proceedings. It seems to be kind of lacking in this round, right? There are 3 types of situations in which somebody gets impeached. The first is that somebody does something blatantly illegal. Clearly, both sides are probably going to solve for this, though we give you specific reasons why if the president's party happens to be in power and the people get ideologically primaried out and Trump claims whatever the hell he wants to claim during the election, during the impeachment proceedings, and doesn't respect it, then he doesn't get impeached for those actions. We think these are probably the top-level consideration on what impeachments ought to occur, because when there's blatant, unethical, and illegal actions happening, if they care about democracy so much, these people clearly do not deserve to exist. Second is when unpopular actions happen. So look, we think that most presidents, in a lot of instances, have to take unpopular actions. And we are okay biting the bullet on the idea that a lot of people are going to take hard choices and end up in situations where maybe the public isn't happy very briefly. Maybe the answer to that is in certain states, in certain places similar to the United States, having things like recall elections, where we actually let the people decide whether that unpopularity is sufficient to remove them. We think that can happen in the presidential system. The answer is not to allow a body that is as lawful as the legislature is to make the political determination for those people, given the backlash issues. The third situation, and this is the one that I think might actually be the most common in a lot of situations, is that there's nothing unpopular particularly, or nothing illegal particularly, but rather an opportunistic legislature that is trying to make political gains. Because of these structures that happen in Congress and other situations, you are significantly worse off on their side of the house. Why? Think about what happened with Bill Clinton. Nothing he did was particularly, to the extent of illegal or needing to be removed from office. It was a spectacle. I'm going to just go into the generally, even if it is true, the motivations were clearly Gingrich trying to flip the House and trying to hold onto a flip that he only pulled off by going hardcore right to flip the House for the first time in 45 fucking years. Given this is the case, then, we need to get more impeachments that look like that. If that is what impeachments look like, and those are detrimental to the United States' ability to work together, they spur polarization. It spurs things like rhetoric that are negative about the opposing party and their ethics in the long long term. If we care about our ability to function as a nation, we always prioritize removing those and focusing primarily on legal ones. Political impeachments are broadly problematic. Let's go to the line by line of the off case. First argument we get is that there's no clear case law, and it's just high crimes and misdemeanors. Okay, the Constitution and similar things in other republics that are similar to the United States use text like this to imply particular legal principles that the courts take and apply from reading, say, the Federalist Papers, from reading older decisions, etc. Maybe there isn't case law yet, but we think they can take the Federalist Papers, make reasonable decisions about what the founders intended, and then apply that through precedent and get consistency into the long term. The fact that we're not doing impeachment rights now isn't a reason we couldn't be doing it right into the future. On the argument that you need a democratic legislature to determine what is good or bad for the country, we just broadly think that even if this is the case, you don't have one, but also this isn't true. We think that generally the question of what is good or bad for the public through questions of impeachment is not to create the most utile outcomes, but rather to uphold the principles that are in founding documents. This means that we ought to trust the people who are the least likely to put their own political bias into those situations and the most likely to believe in the validity of those principles and the ethical requirements of following them. On the idea that you're going to be self-interested because you're appointed by the president. So first, they concede a couple of arguments we made on the on case as to why they're considerably less likely to be self-interested. The lifetime appointments are really sufficient here. Their only answer is maybe you want to do something else afterwards. The only people who do things afterwards are soon retiring to go live up in upstate New Hampshire, where the people aren't going on to further political goals. Given that is the case, then they're always going to be preferable. But also, compare this to Congress, right? The Senate isn't going to impeach Trump or vote on impeachment, because of the political ramifications that happen right now. They are significantly more self-interested and significantly more tied up in the party in question. On the idea that this is not something they can do principally because it's always illegitimate. First, their own framing is that we need to care about functional, not formal questions, so if they win that, it doesn't matter if they're principally just in doing it. It matters only that the legitimacy is found from the end states. Secondarily, though, I think it's pretty clear that when it comes to a question of constitutional interpretation, which is what foundationally impeachment is, we are always preferring taking the body that is the best able to interpret that statute, which means that the actual principal problem is on their side of the house. The legislature isn't built to interpret the Constitution, they are built to be regulated by it. Second, on the idea we're going to delegitimize courts. So, I'm actually going to jump down to the second argument here first. They tell you the leg is better at initiating this. Here's the problem. We still have the legislature initiate. Their warrant here is literally just they're the ones who can determine when's the best instance. They asked us, the POC, about this during the model. So, then the first argument. People aren't going to have opinions for nuance. Exactly. This is the problem. The legislature is going to be responsive to what the people want, but the people don't have any goddamn opinion on these things. Even people as educated as Sandy, going to Ivies and being in semis here, aren't aware of what the emoluments clause is. Do you know who is, though? The 9 justices on the Supreme Court. And they're the ones who are capable of telling you whether or not those things have actually been violated in the first place. They say that the executive won't just go along with the legislature. We think the last big example of this in a country similar to the United States, which is what we modeled of, is Andrew Jackson. And beyond that, we think they are just as likely to disregard what the legislature says. It's unclear why they have meaningfully more power. But also, we don't think the legislature even attempts this in the first place. And it's unclear why, if the court is unable to reasonably check the executive now, it is a problem to find out that this is the case and then try to reform the system. We think that if the president is able to usurp power like this, we're better off finding out earlier and dealing with it in that situation. So, we beat the idea that that the leg is better at initiation because it's always going to happen on, literally it is the same situation of initiation on both sides. They say you can calibrate to the time it's going to succeed. Again, all of those arguments are not unique. On the narratives of national healing. First, there is a massive legitimacy question here. Because yes, liberals don't like Scalia, but they also don't like Mitch McConnell. They also don't like gerrymandering, right? This is a broad argument that can apply to literally any actor in the government. The question is the comparative. Because the rogues are alienating, but they still also bring a sense of trust in those individuals to be apolitical to a greater extent. Maybe it is true that they don't trust Scalia, but they probably trust people who, at least liberal media have told them are, maybe going to vote with them, whether it was Kennedy or other individuals who they view as the swing justices, who are reasonable individuals. That doesn't happen with anybody, and even if it, in Congress, and even if it did, Susan Collins proves that's very fragile with what happened with Kavanaugh. On the idea then, the norms hold democracy together are key. Yes. So let's keep politicization out of questions of constitutional interpretation like impeachment. Let's go to the on case. First argument is that if we still make law, if we think the legislature still make laws, that's enough because it's a function of them. Not only is everything in this round denying whether or not it's an actual function of the legislature, so this argument doesn't really apply. Yeah, maybe we need significant reforms in the current version of legislatures, which we tell you are not only not regulatable, but actively fight against regulation due to their power and due to their lobbying ability and due to the power of political parties, means that the legislatures as they exist are not functional. Also, whatever, right? The implication of this isn't really that important. They tell you that we should regulate instead with no mechanism for that to happen, and we tell you that lobbying and political lock-in and all of the incentives that keep people in power and gerrymander and allow the elites to control the systems mean that you don't regulate Congress out of being dicks. Then we get the argument that there's no lobbying role on these issues. We think that's blatantly false, right? Like, maybe it's not somebody goes up and says, you better vote this way on impeachment, although actually there are super PACs that are focused specifically on impeachment issues. We think that it is the idea that the people who are voting for you or supporting you also support these issues in different ways. The NRA probably is anti-impeachment because they care about other political issues, so when they donate a lot to you, you know how you ought to vote, especially because, as Sandy tells you, the public doesn't actually have strong opinions on this. Then, on the idea that judges are also ideological, I'm actually going to address that a little bit more when we get lower down on the case. You see there's competition between vested interests. This would be true if vested interests attack the same Congress people, but they don't. The NRA doesn't try to lobby Nancy Pelosi in the same way they try to lobby Mitch McConnell, so there isn't competition between the vested interests on an individual scale, which means there's no meaningful decisions ever being made. They say that people deliberate deeply, or like the current people deliberate deeply on these issues, but we tell you there's just like a lot of information to worry about in constitutional history. It doesn't have to be a requirement to literally serve in Congress. It does for the courts. On polarization, we tell you there's media incentives and that they act under political expediency. So even if U.S. primaries are the only version of this, which by the way still exists, it doesn't matter. Also, like when they do lose, it pushes you and you have to have ideological purity. It doesn't matter if you shift back. Then balance of power. They say the Congress, actually, yes, fine, impeachment only happens a few times on the other side of the House, but we want the better version of it on our side. On courts, good. They say you alienate by robes and it's Scalia and all of that. Here's the thing. We think that people generally trust the courts more because they know lifetime appointments, because they know there's no party structure, because they know that there is no lobbying, which have become huge boogeymen in American and other politics. On self-selection, they say Congress people can also be poor. This is true, but the comparative is that these people who are legal scholars could be working in big law or literally anything else, and instead of picking this, but also if they are self-interested, they're self-interested in prestige, which again comes from consistency, comes from fairness, and comes from principles like upholding the Constitution. So the self-interest aligns with the good incentives on our side of the House.
Here.
I think the MG and call upon the MO. Remarks and call upon the LO for the first rebuttal speech of the round. Remind them to make no new arguments, but you can have new examples.
First, let's be very clear. This isn't what courts do and can't be what courts do. Their only argument is that there exists some case law that courts could assess, but that was never the point. The point was that that isn't the only thing they are being asked to do. They are also being asked to make a subjective moral decision about values such as the national interest, about high crimes versus regular crimes and low crimes, about how a leader ought to represent their people. Impeachment is a subjective and democratic decision. At that point, you should decide whether a democratic institution, which may be imperfect, even if we can't also propose some regulation, is better at making that decision than an institution which is not democratic and was never trying to be. I do not think they beat this argument. However, let's talk about the functional effect of impeachment. So, I don't think that the political impeachments are particularly germane to this round, because we gave you arguments that the public, particularly moderates, tend to want this perception of a properly functioning government where people play by the rules and don't throw sand in each other's eyes, and you have to appeal to moderates to win general elections. So there is going to be a risk of making a frivolous impeachment. You feel like you're going to be punished on either side of the house. So this probably is a debate about particularly egregious instances. In this context, we would agree that impeachment is a functional check, not a formal one. Now, in the cases where someone did something truly bad, how are we better at checking it? First, because the legislator picks their moment better. So yes, the legislature still initiates, but the argument is, when do they initiate? When it is through the courts, they make the decision when to initiate when there is a formal legal case. When it is through the legislature, they choose to initiate when there is a political case. But we told you in LOC that a formal legal case isn't enough. It leads to things like Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner running as the vice president but really being in charge of the ticket, or just finding a proxy to represent your political interest because you won in the courts but no one cares on the streets. It doesn't work. It is not a functional check unless you choose your moment wisely. Second, though, legislatures are just a different type of proceeding. So I think we make this argument, which is that when you are making speeches and having this debate and having these hearings about impeachment in the legislature, we are calibrating our rhetoric towards making people understand and making people care about the malfeasance that has been committed. They say, well, there's no persuasion because everyone's already made their mind up. But I think this is preempted with the argument that you have to predict what people's minds will be in the future. That is to say, you aren't just trying to reflect public opinion, you're also trying to shape it. You're also trying to engage in a discourse over what really bad things are in the context of the responsibilities of governance. And in those contexts, it's really important that people understand why these things were bad, because only if they understand why those things were bad will they not vote for future people who promise to do those things, and will they actually be able to hold these norms and hold that democracy together. If it is a legal decision, people will default to what their side thinks and hide behind the obtuse technicalities that they don't understand, even though I know what the emoluments clause is, kind of. But they will not actually engage with the rhetoric, they will not actually engage with why these things are bad, which is required for them to actually enforce these norms. That's a better check. Third, though, courts won't be able to enforce other things. So we would argue that the most important check on the executive isn't getting rid of the executive and getting the vice president. It's when the executive does something unconstitutional, you can stop them, right? And the argument that we made is that this isn't a given, right? Even people like Boris Johnson in the UK ignore courts. He can recite some of the Aeneid, but ignoring courts is still bad. So when courts are politicized, it is more politically acceptable to ignore those courts. It is more politically acceptable and harder for those courts to enforce and stop the executive from doing the unconstitutional things in the first case. So there probably aren't that many frivolous impeachments on either side of the House. But on our side of the House, we pick our moments better, we present our arguments better, and we can actually enforce against unconstitutional things. We provide a better functional check against the abuse of the executive. Even if they aren't considering their arguments as carefully as our obtuse panel considered their deliberation, I still think we're clearly ahead.
I thank the speaker for their remarks and call upon the PMR. Same conditions.
Cool. Is everyone good to go? We're going to get real macro here. What's an impeachment supposed to be about? Because they say it's supposed to be about subjective things like the national interest. But why? We articulate very clearly that we don't believe that that's what the point of the impeachment process is. If that process is about bad decision-making and stuff like that, we think there's some possibility of recall elections or elections in general that provide a check for that. We give you three things that lead to impeachments in the status quo in the world generally. First, illegal action, the top-level considerations that are very clearly slam dunks for the courts to actually decide, because they can just adjudicate, well, this was fucking illegal, this was bad, we need to do this. Their consistent actions and their reliance upon documentation means they'll always have a 100% chance of solving this, whereas on their side of the House, maybe it's not super common, they're going to immediately just say illegal actions are okay, but you can get into political expedient instances where that is actually bad. That's going to be imperatively bad. Second, the unpopular actions. In that case, it's unlikely that this needs to be a level of impeachment. There's a democratic check that can exist in terms of things like recall elections that should be applied here as well. Third, the absurd actions. This is what's really, really important. It only is true that we need the legislature to determine the gray area impeachments when they're the ones deciding gray area impeachments. It is only an action used for them for political expediency. Yeah, they know the right moment to do it. They're trying to win an election, not trying to actually impeach the president. This is demeaning and actually politicizes the idea of impeachment because it's a political actor taking it. We would say that in a world in which they can initiate based on levels of popularity or when they think there's some severe problem, and then the court can decide that, it will not be nearly as politicized as what they're talking about because what they're defending is the status quo, what it's actually been doing in the legislature, what's been intensely politicized and is frequently seen as illegitimate because talking heads on both sides get on the media, say very radical things to the media, loves to project that shit, and then polarizes society. The moderates were key. The response to our argument that people trust the courts, but that radicals don't trust certain justices. That was never the point. Those radicals don't trust Congress either. But the moderate people that don't know congressmen very well, but see Congress as ultimately a very political, very divisive place, an ideological place, and see the spectacle of the courts, and see the procedure, and see the documentation. They don't need to know the legalese. In fact, the legalese going over their head is more consequence and assurance for them that the right decisions are being made because they don't understand it. This means that they actually buy into the system far more often, are less likely to become more radicalized as we increasingly bombard them with political messages where Trump says this is actually just the elites taking us over, and the Democrats say the Republican Party is full of fascists that need to get overthrown. Maybe, but regardless. All that means then that this is just functionally how politicization actually happens. It comes from the Congress and the language that they utilize when they do these impeachments and when they try them themselves. When legalese is utilized, for one, politicized problems don't actually come up, and then that means we actually get real solvency. Yeah.
I'm not sure, but in response to all of the sort of chats about politicization, the claim that politicization didn't exist preceding the rhetoric of Congress in the impeachment determinations is, I think, a new bird.
This is the Newt Gingrich argument that Parker made.
We'll take it under consideration.
The second framing question is that constitutional concerns are only allowed to be done by the court. Constitutionality is only meant to be determined by the court itself. It doesn't matter if it can be political or it's actually the lens of the decision is constitutional interpretations and are derivative from documents that these congressmen don't actually know. This means that the only body that can take this action legitimately in the U.S.-style government is the courts, built to interpret the Constitution and actually are required to do so, so functionally this is actually the purpose. If we care about having a principally legitimate question, we would always prefer this. Case law also doesn't exist in the U.S. because we haven't done this right before. The norms of consistency will happen and resolve specific attentions later. Emma says that understanding the framework's intent is hard, we prefer to change it over time. First, this is clearly wrong. We wouldn't elaborate principal violations then. Second, it doesn't matter. It's a constitutional obligation as the court that exists and in the framing of our government. Third, the intent here is clear. They wrote in the impeachment. So basically, then they say after this, like the politicization thing, right? Like what happens if the court just gets ignored by the presidency, right? This is their big thing they hang on their head about the idea of politicization. So for one, we control the link to politicization. That politicization only happens when the legislator is more apt to do it. Secondarily, though, Parker points out that this is equally bad on both sides, that the president can just ignore Congress just as much as he can ignore the courts as well. But most importantly, what Parker pointed out to you is that if it is the case that that would happen, that someone could actually do that, then we need to know that is possible, that could actually happen, so we can make the much-needed reforms necessary in our system. This isn't some like pseudo-corrupt government that could always happen forever. We have the potential and power to reform these systems. We need to test the delineations and problems of our structures that are ultimately far, far worse. Beyond that, though, let's talk about things like the balance of powers that we're talking about in the system of government. Very clearly, Congress controls the president entirely in this situation, but the president has a lot of mud to throw back and ultimately leads to much more mudslinging and politicization that we think is far, far worse. On their side of the House, there's no check on the courts, and the courts have no meaningful check on the executive. They're correct when they say that like the presidency has a check on the courts because it can appoint them, but there's no mutual check back. They say that they can say that certain things are unconstitutional, sure, but that is not nearly the check that Congress is being provided against the presidency, where they can both initiate and create those things to happen. We think that is significantly far, far worse. At the end of the day, I think the weighing they gave the bottom of the PMC was never meaningfully contested. What the point of the government is, in the most macro level sense, is to keep the peace in our society, to prevent the radical violence that can happen in our side, on either side, that can happen in any sort of society that has politics and rules and stuff like that. Who do we trust more to keep the peace? Politicized people with very short-term interests who want to make money and will take lobbying jobs in the future, who listen to their very ideological bases and not very many people else, who themselves are not familiar with legal documentation and now have the power to both initiate and do these things when it's politically expedient for them to do so, or the people who have been appointed by moderate checks because they're so ideological in Congress they have to compromise and put these people forward, that is bought into by the vast majority of the public and meaningfully trusted in the sense that Congress never is, and actually knows the standards are necessary to meaningfully impeach someone for the ways they ought to be impeached. That policy is not the reason why you impeach someone. Breaking the fucking law is, demeaning the norms of this society are. The norms are dictated and framed by the Constitution, by the Supreme Court, and ultimately we think that keeps the peace far better than anybody else in Congress. Proud of your parents.
Thanks everyone for what was essentially a debate. And now please leave.
What does Centurion not in itself like how it's going to be sentenced, but like